Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from the 29th chapter in the book of Proverbs. And there's a lot to cover here, and we'd like to, if possible, make it the whole way through. So we're going to minimize the customarily lengthier preamble and just say the bare essentials. Proverbs is a book in the Old Testament devoted to Proverbs, which is a literary device of pithy sayings of condensed wisdom. And the Hebrews were not unique in having the literary device, but their form was unique from every other culture's in that it was divinely inspired. So that being said, we're going to hop right into it, and the opening verse reads, "He who being often reproved hardens his heart shall be cut off, and that without remedy." So the obstinate or obdurate man in Scripture is a rebel, and they're referred to as hardened of heart or stiff-necked. Yahweh frequently bemoans the stiff-neckedness of Israel and the hardened heart, and the concept is the same. It's basically someone who is stubbornly persist in their sin and errors, and they have to learn. They invite the consequence of pain, and even after being meted out the pain, which is the consequence of their actions, they persist in their sin, and there is no hope for them, essentially. If I think he says in 26:11, a dog returning to its own vomit is the way of the fool. And when the righteous increase, the people rejoice, but when a wicked one rules, the people sigh. So this is a self-evident statement. The people naturally long, demand, and deserve to live under righteous rule. As the leaders, they set the example and the tone of society. Ergo, it is incumbent that they behave and rule and righteously as opposed to wickedly. And the fact of human nature is that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So the danger was certainly there in Israel's monarchy, but Solomon did rule righteously for the most part. "He who loves wisdom gladdens his father, but a companion of whores destroys wealth." Can't really argue with the first one, wise children. Now, this book is very much oriented toward its address to his child. It's questionable to the extent that he was writing with posterity in mind, because the book is addressed to his son in various locations. Even if it's not written to us, it is very much written for us, and we can benefit from the wisdom therein. But the companion of whores reminds one of the New Testament parable of the prodigal son in Luke 15:11 through 32. The prodigal squandered his inheritance on riotous living, and the nature of his brother's complaint when he returned was that he squandered it all on whores, and his brother had his own issues to address. He had the sin of self-righteousness, but that's another subject entirely. "A king establishes a land by justice, but one who receives bribes throws it down." So bribes corrupt and compromise the equitable rule, and it invites corruption, and it is a source of evil which allows scheming, corrupt, and Machiavellian men to manipulate others for their own advancement through bribes, and it is something that all of us to some extent are not immune from accepting, even if we're not capable of paying. But as a righteous ruler, the bribes, the existence or fact of it would have been abhorrent to a man like Solomon. "A man who flatters his neighbor spreads a net for his own feet." So flattery is something we are all somewhat seduced by. We all long to be acclaimed and esteemed, and the natural man is a rebel who desires to be a celebrity, a pampered celebrity, and not a servant by nature. But the kisses of enemies are more deadly than the stings of the friends is another proverb. And so always be mindful of the motivation for which others flatter you. That is something we are not entirely privy to, but we can develop the discernment through diligence as to at least imagining or anticipating the intents and motives of others. "An evil man is ensnared by transgression, but the righteous sings and rejoices." So the snaring entails a trapping element. So sin is a trap. It tricks the sinner into thinking that they can find satisfaction in the sin when it invariably leads to decay and ultimately ruin, and ultimately death. In the final analysis, the wages of sin are declared to be death in Romans 6:23, and there's actually a host of other proverbs which correspond to that passage. I might actually do a lesson on that soon, but that's getting a little far ahead of ourselves. But righteous sings and rejoice. That's just he who is too blessed to be stressed will be inclined to praise and be grateful and express their gratitude through song and rejoicing. The righteous knows the pleas of the poor. The wicked do not understand knowledge. So being rich often insulates people from the plights and the struggles of the poor, but Solomon was very much mindful that the majority of his subjects live considerably less than him, but he was mindful of them, and he was impartial in executing justice, and for anything that he personally judged would have never been partial to the rich, we may somewhat accurately imagine. And that the wicked, they don't know, and they think they know the way to exploit and to manipulate others for their self-interest, but they really are lacking in knowledge or wisdom. Scoffers ensnare a city, but the wise turn away wrath. So this is an antithetical juxtaposition, which is a common format. I believe we've already covered some earlier, which presents one thing and then presents its opposite, and there's usually an opposite outcome for the opposite outlook. So here, the scoffer is, again, we read the word again, ensnare. So they a single fool can have a devastating ripple effect on an entire society, but the wise person will use diplomacy to mitigate conflict and aggression from outside forces. When a wise man disputes with a foolish man, whether he rages or laughs, there is no peace. So fools are inclined to argue by their very nature. That is not to suggest that argument or debate is a forbidden activity for intelligent people. It is only to say that fools take a peculiar delight in them. They like striving controversy for its own sake. They like being loud. They like being heard. They like talking more than they like listening, and that is the nature of the fool, and that is often the nature of the argument, at least as inasmuch as the fool executes the argument. And so he says it's not even worth it. That's something the wise person will have to exercise discernment as to when to disengage from indulging someone in an argument who's not going to be worth the effort, not worth the spit. Bloodthirsty men hate the perfect and seek the life of the straight. So perfect is not literally perfect, but it is pure, or basically integrity. Strictly speaking, the only perfect one is the divine one, Elohim, who exists in infinite and eternal attributes and perfections. But I think Job and a few other characters in Scripture use the word which we translate as perfect, but in the human context it means one who lives with unimpeachable integrity and unassailable morality, and they often have targets on their back because the wicked envy them or they want to exploit them. They see a vulnerability in someone who's like that, and they seek to exploit it. And it can be deadly, the fact is. And inasmuch as we walk righteously, we are virtually all but promised the persecution as for the way of our walk, for following the way. A fool lets out all his breath, but the wise calms it down afterwards. So this is a concept we find throughout the writings of Solomon in wisdom literature. Foolishness by its very nature is self-aggrandizing and self-advertising, and it's conceited enough to take refuge in the frequency and volume of words, whereas a wise person will think before they talk. They don't just spout out the mouth, whereas a fool cannot help themselves, and little do they know they're only proclaiming their foolishness. So even though they're saying a lot, they're actually saying nothing. and a wise person will make each word count. And they are able to neutralize the excessively winded outburst of the fools in their midst. If a ruler listens to lying words, all his servants become wicked. So the reality of rulership in ancient Near Eastern monarchy was that a ruler was surrounded by advisors, and the people, this is a universal principle for whatever our rank and station in society. The people we gravitate and surround ourselves with, we will mimic and become by reflection and proxy of interaction. So the ruler, it was incumbent upon them to surround themselves with wise advisors, and Rehoboam, who is the immediate audience of this target audience of this book, who was Solomon's successor as the king, listened to foolish counsel in the first book of Kings, the 12th chapter. Solomon, long story short, had resorted to conscripted labor amongst Israelite citizens, an explicit violation of the Mosaic law towards the end of his reign. And the backbreaking labor was a source of consternation amongst his subjects. And so they approached Rehoboam, and Solomon's to lighten the load and to moderate the oppression. And Solomon's counselors influenced Rehoboam to accommodate their request and meet them halfway. But the wicked friends he surrounded himself with and grew up at court told him to say, "My father stinged you with a whip, I will sting you with scorpions." And that essentially almost immediately fractured the kingdom into the united monarchy of Israel would be no more. It would be henceforth the divided kingdoms. In the north was Israel, comprised of the 10 tribes, and the kingdom of Judah, which comprised the territory belonging to Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. The poor man and the oppressor have this in common. Yahweh gives light to the eyes of both. So there's an equality in humanity in the divine derivatives, that being the image and the life that we owe to. Now Elohim makes his sun to shine and rain to fall on the wicked and righteous alike. So in some sense, the wicked are unknowing beneficiaries of unmerited grace, whereas the grateful person is inclined to pay homage to the source of the blessings and to gratefully acknowledge the gifts with the giver in mind. But we all have the same blood, we all breathe the same air, and we all have the same image intact in us. The king who rightly rules the poor with truth. His throne is established forever. So ruling the poor with truth means not to be swayed by their more financially endowed oppressors who would have taken them to court to sue them for everything they're worth, which is a very real reality in ancient Israel. But the principle is that one who administers justice to the poor can expect a throne to live forever. And according to the terms of the covenant, Israel was promised blessings innumerable for obedience, but the tragedy is that the terms of the covenant, the demands of obedience, were simply beyond their capacity to obey, and they did not last forever. They were fractured, the northern kingdom in 722 BM, and the southern kingdom of Judah by the Babylonians in 586 BM. A rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child unrestrained brings shame to his mother. Now, a child left to their own devices, they have no sense of other people's property or even needs or wants or even an existence in some sense. Human beings are self-centered creatures where organisms and of such were geared to our survival, and the child doesn't really have an awareness or an empathy that more mature people do. So it is incumbent to exercise discipline, because the child is not going to self-discipline itself. Left to its own devices, it's going to eat candy for breakfast, for example. But that's where the loving parental discipline comes in, and discipline is very much identified as an act of love in somewhere in the 3rd chapter of Proverbs and also the 12th chapter of Hebrews. But the rod and reproof, now a lot of our modern sensibilities may scoff at the notion of resorting to what we deem child abuse, but historically it has been the norm, and the scriptures does caution against excess in administering abuse. I think Ephesians 6, 1-2 impose limitations on parental discipline to be administered. When the wicked become many, transgressions increase, but the righteous look on their fall. So this is the microcosm representing the macrocosm. A nation is comprised, a national character is comprised of the individual characters which collectively comprise it. So righteous people, now nations can be defined by wickedness at various points, and that means the wicked are in the majority. But wickedness by its very nature is fleeting, fragile, and will not last. And so when they collapse, as they invariably will, the one who maintains the integrity of their righteousness will be left to point the finger, if so inclined. Discipline your son, and he brings you rest and delight to your life. Now, discipline is an often unpleasant necessity. No one likes the fact that they may have to strike their child, but if necessary, it can very much be an act of love. And discipline is by no means limited to physical discipline. That's just the extreme. There's also the examples and language they impose. You can't let a child swear after a certain age, for example. And this will be a source of solace and peace, which will bring us rest and delight and pleasure and happiness and content and joy. When there is no vision, the people perish, but blessed is he who guards the Torah, the law. So vision is an essential element in any organization comprised of human beings, be it a local church or a nation. A vision is a destination and its ideals that we aspire towards and practical pursuits that we engage in. And in the absence of such, we ultimately diminish and perish. But the Torah, the law of Moses, exists to prevent the natural wicked inclinations of the Hebrew people, who were, after all, people, and as such fallen and subject to sin. But when the Torah was honored by a king, they were instructed to carry a portable copy for their personal study in Deuteronomy 17. So the ruler was to set the example, and they were to provide the vision and stay grounded in the Torah. Now, vision in itself, strictly speaking, is morally neutral. Its character is wholly comprised by the nature of it. So, for example, Adolf Hitler was a man of vision, but it was very much a perverted vision. But vision, we understand it to be implicitly positive. A servant is not disciplined by words. Though he understands, he does not respond. So this is suggesting that a servant at least has the capacity or the potentiality to be unmoved by words, and to appropriate the quotation from the Enlightenment thinker Rousseau, with men use words, with children use force. And masters did often resort to force to control their slaves, who were their legal property, and as such had no rights or liberties as we know them. Have you seen a man hasty in his words? There is more hope for a fool than him. So someone who talks before they think rather than think before they talk, and says too much and blurts their whatever's on their heart, whatever's on their mind, without really thinking, without being mindful of what's on their mind, is very much foolish. So there's really no distinction between a fool and one who engages in foolish activity. He who deals tenderly with his servant from youth has him as a son in the end. So the potential, now the master-servant relationship was very much a fact of life in the ancient world, and the Hebrews were certainly no exception. But the potential did exist. There could exist love between the ideal master and servant relationship was defined by love, and the potential to be loved as a son was very much possible, and did in fact frequently manifest, although it wasn't the norm, but it was very much possible. A man of displeasure stirs up strife, and a master of rage has many a transgression. So anger is not only a sin in itself, but it is a host of other troubles. It leads to quarrels and ill-chosen words and volatile, bitter resentment. So it's really, anger is destructive, and displeasure takes delight in misery enjoys company, as the old adage goes. Ergo, the miserable people try and sink as many people down to their level as they can, and they will not be satisfied until everyone in their path is at least as miserable as them. That's the nature of misery, and that's why the adversary does what he does, because he knows he's doomed. So anyone who's seduced by Satan is going to be betrayed in the end. He really doesn't have your best interest at heart. The pride of man brings him low, but the humble in spirit obtains obscene. So this is a double paradoxical juxtaposition, which reminds one of the New Testament principle of the humble shall be exalted, and the reverse. So pride brings a man low. Now humility and humiliation are both etymologically rooted in the same Latin term, humus, which means ground or earth. So the difference between a humble person is that they voluntarily bring themselves to ground. They don't exalt themselves unnecessarily at the expense of others. But a humble person will persist in exalting themselves until they are humiliated. And the difference between humiliation and humility is humility comes from an external agent, whereas humility is self-imposed. Humiliation is very often violently and rarely pleasant to be humiliated. He who shares with the thief hates his own life. He who hears an oath but does not report. He hears an oath but does not report. Now, thieves, even in some sense, should at least honor a code of honesty amongst themselves. They don't enter into business arrangements with other thieves if they're going to steal from them, but in the end, they're all thieves, and eventually someone will. So it's really an inferior foundation for friendship or relationship. Thieves, we shouldn't really have anything to do with them if we value our own lives and the quality thereof. The fear of man brings a snare, but he who trusts in Yahweh is made high. So again, once more, for the third time, we witness the word snare or some derivative thereof. So fear is, it compromises one's ability to arrive at rational or moral decisions. It's often governed. Now, fear can be alternately a rational response to a real danger or an irrational response to a perceived danger, and the latter is a species of cowardice, whereas fears are completely legitimate even to the faithful and courageous. And courage is not the absence of fear, but it's the embracing of fear and the conquering. And of course, the fear of Yahweh is the fear which expels all other fears. There's a variety of verses in the scripture. Exodus 20:20 springs immediately to mind. Many seek the face of a ruler, but justice for a man comes from Yahweh. So people naturally look to human entities to secure justice, and they live in the world, and the inhabitants of this world who work on such a mindset. But the fact is that if you're seeking for perfect justice in the world, you won't find it, at least from another man. And Solomon, even though he did rule justly for the most part, in as much as he was humanly able to, he was still very much aware of Yahweh's perfect justice, and he tried at least to model and emulate that in his limited, finite capacity. An unrighteous man is an abomination to the righteous, and he who is straight in the way is an abomination to the wicked. So this is the battle line between the righteous and the wicked. We are existential enemies, and abomination is the most derogatory term one can think of in reference to someone else or something else. So unrighteousness and wickedness are perpetually at war, and they have different agendas and different natures and are therefore incompatible. But if we do side ourselves with the righteous, it is a daily endeavor, and there are literally thousands of decisions in a day which can shape our character and determine the outcome. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. Tune in next time. Bye-bye.